Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and this is the 2024 Job Market series where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. I spoke with Atanu Chatterjee, a PhD candidate in geography at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and a lecturer at the School of Human Settlements, XIM University, Bhubaneswar. We discussed his dissertation examining the in situ slum rehabilitation scheme through a state-led intervention in low-income housing in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. We talked about the reasons for the emergence of urban slums in Ahmedabad, the successes and failures of the in situ slum rehabilitation scheme, the differences across 4 recent slum redevelopments, the types of problems residents face post-rehabilitation, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Sometimes it can feel like a full-time job keeping tabs on the latest development in politics in India. If you're struggling to keep up, let the Grand Tamasha podcast be your guide. Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the world's most respected think tanks, and the Hindustan Times, one of India's leading media houses. Each week, host Milan Vaishnav takes listeners on a deep dive into Indian politics, economics, foreign policy, culture, and society. Over the past 5 years, Grand Tamasha has published more than 200 conversations on the issues that matter most to Indians and those who watch India from abroad, featuring guests ranging from the comedian Hasan Minhaj to the historian Ramachandra Guha and the philanthropist Rohini Nilekani. Grand Tamasha is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Subscribe now to get your weekly infusion of timely and provocative India content straight to your personal device. New episodes are released every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Visit www.grandtamasha.com to browse past episodes and to learn more about the show. Atanu, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I was just telling you that only the geography PhD sent me an entire dissertation, which is always exciting. And we've had a few geography scholars over the years. So I actually got your entire dissertation, which was very fun. And you look at basically slum redevelopment. You're looking at a particular slice of it, which is in situ slum redevelopment rehabilitation schemes, specifically in the urban setting of Ahmedabad. And, you look at 4 case studies that we can talk about more. And the idea behind rehabilitation is typically to improve sort of, living conditions in the slum for slum dwellers, but also for people who are sort of adjacent to the slum because there are all these public health, sanitation sort of issues. The goal is to get these folks proper housing, some security of tenure or property rights, better access to, water, electricity, sanitation, sewage, all those sorts of things. And this has been controversial in India for a long time on how we do this rehabilitation. The earlier mentality was, okay, we're just going to pick these people up and transplant them somewhere far away in a really nice location, except that view has now been completely debunked because cities are fundamentally labor markets. And so the goal is to keep them in the same place, have them in the same economic and social networks. So now the sort of new thinking in this space is we should rehabilitate them in situ, by which we mean wherever the original slum is, we transition the residents out for a short period, we build new housing in the same location, and then we move these folks back in. And for this, sometimes the government builds the scheme themselves. Sometimes they partner with, private developer. There are lots of policy issues at play. One, of course, is urban. There's, of course, literally building these buildings, but also the broader question of who gets included and who gets excluded in these slums. Typically, there's a cutoff point of some sort. And finally, how do we make sure that the residents, there's a huge disruption in their lives, but how can we make this situation better than what it was before in the slum? Is this a good way of thinking about what you're trying to do?
Yes. This is a good way to start this conversation, because for the last many years this model is ongoing and it's very popular in India, particularly after the introduction of Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, housing for all, in 2015. So, and earlier we only talked about, or we only know about Mumbai slum redevelopment scheme, but nowadays many states are now implementing slum redevelopment scheme. So this is a good time to rethink that what we are doing under slum redevelopment, whether it is a uh, good policy that we are looking for, or so all sorts of question we can ask.
No, and you do ask them before we get to your evaluation of like four particular cases. This is Lakhudi, Talavadi, Sanjay Nagar, the slum behind B Colony, and Kailash Nagar. These are the four
Yes.
slum rehabilitation programs you look at. But before we get into that, for those who are unfamiliar with the urban slum problems, can you just zoom out a little bit and tell us about how these slums emerge and what is the role they play in urban settings? Because nobody wants to live in those conditions, but people obviously do in very large numbers, so there must be a reason for it. And then we can talk about the rehabilitation part.
I can give you three framework to understand slum. That the first framework, which is more of a problematic framework to understand slum, that's we define or understand slum more like a spatial or analytical category, that a residential space which have access do not have access to basic amenities, facilities, living in overcrowded or substandard housing, lack of security of tenure. Okay, but we do not ask question beyond that. So we always say that this place is unfit for human habitation, and state always justify their action against those spaces by defining slum in this way. Second is all the whole idea of formality, informality, or legality and illegality, right? That for
Yes.
who is legal, who is illegal, who is citizen, who is not citizen, and that is essentially related to how they came up in the city. That the question that you asked, that usually slum come up in the public land or private land. They encroached public land and private land. The vacant land or the land remained reserved for various public utilities and amenities, and over the time they develop a settlement. So the construction of building or the occupation of land is always in contravention with the development plan, which actually govern the urban planning, the master plan that popularly known as. That's why those places called informal settlement, slum popularly. Although I think you know that this particular discourse has been criticized by scholars like Ananya Roy and many others, that informality not only encompasses urban poor but also the middle class and elite, because this land occupation and the whole illegality. That slum is also a economic space, and also a very vibrant social space, and also definitely a site of political engagement and negotiation, right? So in that case, slum dweller hugely contribute to the city. If I go back, I think long ago Joycean wrote an article that it's more like an unintended city, right? And I think later Ashish Nandi said that it's like slum as self confrontation. I think so. So it's show our attitude toward them, but we often ignore that the economic contribution that they make to the urban living, that the whole informal economy thrives in slum, and our maid and our auto driver and all of them often come from slum. It's also a place of cultural diversity. Many slums in India, like Dharavi, like in Ahmedabad, we come called Hollywood Basti, in Kolkata, Kumartuli. All of these slums are very culturally rich settlement. So these are three ways we can actually look at slum.
So, a fourth aspect I would add is when we're looking at slums, we're typically only looking at that location and those people, but it also depends on what's happening everywhere else around them. So, what are the zoning laws in place around these slums? What are the housing policies in place that are causing this massive housing shortage, especially for low-income groups or migrants who have recently moved to the urban setting and so on? So it is actually a much larger problem because nobody who could afford otherwise would want to live in these settings. Right? Which means that there's something wrong with the choice set to begin with. And the supply of housing has not adjusted to the kind of demand there is for housing. And sometimes it's not adjusted because, we have terrible zoning laws, FSI requirements and things like that. Sometimes it's not adjusted because we have basically our entire cityscape is designed for the rich and the middle class. Every home must have X number of bedrooms and windows of this size and 2 fire exits. And so it's either panacea or slums, right? So these are really the choices that are offered to people as opposed to tailoring them across all income levels, household sizes, and so on. So I feel like now I see that in your work, but I'm also seeing that in other people's work on how what's happening outside the slum is also being studied and integrated into why the slum exists in the first place, or how it is emerging and how it's being governed and so on.
Yes. So the governance aspect and the planning and legal aspect is also very much responsible for the production of slum that you have mentioned. Like in Ahmedabad also, people have documented that building regulations is responsible for production of unaffordable housing, and many people are not able to access affordable housing. That's why they resorted to slums.
Yeah, and urban sprawl, right? Because I'm sure they can find housing somewhere, but the point is, you want your chauffeurs and maids and, domestic workers and school teachers and auto rickshaw drivers to show up and report for duty at 7 a.m. And so it's not exactly feasible. Like cities will come to a standstill if we actually relocate these folks outside of the city, or new people will come and take that spot in the same location.
I would like to just add one point here that most often is also contextual. Like in the city like Ahmedabad, where many social, economic, political factors played a role in proliferation of slum, like closure of textile mill or communal violences. And I have seen many slums which produce only because of communal violences. So most often we do not talk about those socio-political factors which are also responsible for production of slum in cities.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the communal violence part? Because that is very unique to some cities, right? Like Ahmedabad or Meerut. There are some cities which are prone to recurring violence over the decades, and there is this massive displacement because of the violence. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that has played out in Ahmedabad? And because, the other aspects might be relatively more comparable to other cities.
So what I have observed, long back in 2014, I think I have kind of visited a slum, Allah Nagar. Okay, predominantly resided by the Muslim population. So because at that time I wanted to understand, the origin and evolutions of informal settlement in the city. So what I understand that that slum located in the public land, particularly in the periphery of the city, and when I asked them why you came here, and all of them said that yes, because we only know that 2002 this Godhra riot and aftermath, but before that also there are 1969 communal violences and the repetitive communal, which is not documented and maybe documented in some research article or books, but not widely known. So all of these communal violences force people to look for the community of their own, and which happened, and so that they moved to a place where there are people live, and that's how a small locality converted into a slum or a slum neighborhood there.
And there are also maybe I'm getting this awfully wrong and you can correct me. I believe in Ahmedabad and many cities there are also rules on who people can buy and sell housing from, and it has to be within the same community. I am not familiar with the exact regulation, but maybe you can tell us more about it. So if a community wishes to live together past a point, the only alternative is to move into something which is completely illegal or informal when none of these rules are enforced, which ends up becoming a slum. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, there is a act, of the state. I do not remember the name of that act, but there is a act that Muslim population cannot buy a house in the Hindu locality, and there is a sharp spatial segregation that you can see. I think you all know that there are many such popular settlement which is segregated and also documented by Darshini Mahadevia and other scholars that how this spatial segregation impacted the pa- people of a particular religion and particularly the urban poor. This has also happened in the context of resettlement because Ahmedabad is a fascinating place to study. Why? Because in 2005 they have implemented basic services for the urban poor, Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, and they have kind of resettled the people from the central city to the periphery of the city. So there are many locations like Batawa and all, predominantly decided by the Muslim population. So this spatial segregation actually played out a very important role in city making, I would say, in Ahmedabad.
So now that we understand, how these slums have emerged, can you just tell us about how this rehabilitation and redevelopment plays out, specifically in the four areas that you studied? And then maybe we can get into the differences on those four case studies. But first, I just want to hear from you how you view this rehabilitation and redevelopment effort in the first place.
So there are the broader context of slum development that there are three or four such approaches which emerged over the year. One is definitely slum relocation, as we are talking, which is definitely not a viable model. Second is slum upgradation, essentially in situ slum upgradation, where you are not placing them with a new apartment complex or an apartment building, but you are only taking care of their basic needs like improve their basic infrastructure services, or give them some financial assistance to improve their housing, or give them security of tenure. And then this in situ slum redevelopment, where you demolish the existing informal settlement and construct the multi-story apartment complexes and accommodate
Yeah.
them, which is happening in Ahmedabad. Interestingly, Ahmedabad experimented with all of these policies. So back in
Yeah.
1990, Ahmedabad then implemented slum networking project, which is very popular back then, and still people appreciate the whole intention of that model. Essentially improve the environmental quality of the settlement. And interestingly, they give them some verbal assurance that you will not be evicted for 10 years. And that works wonder. I have
Yeah.
visited many of those settlements where slum networking project has been implemented, and they have upgraded their housing and improved their living condition. Then in 2005, as I was mentioning, that Ahmedabad implemented basic services for urban poor. They resettled them in the periphery of the city. It is also well documented that how kind of derogatory that policy was and what impact it had in the life of the urban poor household. Then in 2010, everything has changed because what we know so far that in 2010, Gujarat government, it's a state government policy, introduced a scheme, regulations for the redevelopment and rehabilitation of the slum. They welcome private developer, similar to the Mumbai model for rehabilitation of the slum dwellers. As I have documented, Lakhudi Talavari and Sanjay Nagar, those two cases are from 2010 policy.
Yeah.
What happened after that? Within 3 years of introduction of slum redevelopment scheme, Gujarat government replaced that earlier scheme with a new policy guideline, the rehabilitation of slum dweller in public land in 2013. And they have made various changes in the 2013 policy. But the approaches remain the same, that rehabilitation of the slum dweller in situ with the active participation of the slum dweller. Within this context, if I really want to, which I actually thought that it is interesting to look at the informality through the lens of slum redevelopment scheme, because it is essentially a transformation of the not only the physical space but also the life and living of the slum dweller, and how this transition is happening, or how this transition is impacting the life of the slum dweller. That is something that we can ask.
So Ahmedabad oftentimes is pointed out as a major success story, right? And the reason for the success story is, first of all, unlike many other cities, the rehabilitation is actually thought out. There's all the processes are followed basically, right? There's a tender put out, people are invited, the plans are evaluated, the people are moved out, not always with some compensation, but temporary. But the most important part of Ahmedabad's success story when it comes to rehabilitation is actually happens, which is not a guarantee in most Indian cities, right? Like private developers get these contracts that slums never built. In Delhi, we have this huge problem right now where they physically look like they built a housing colony, but it doesn't have water, it doesn't have electricity. So that's the good news, right? So in everything that you studied, largely the physical infrastructure that was promised actually exists. Now, there are problems beyond physical infrastructure, but is that a good way to at least start how we evaluate these projects, that the reason they are touted as a success is because other cities just do so much worse even on the basic construction and moving people back?
That's a very valid point. That is something I have observed, that yes, that
Yeah.
Ahmedabad is a city which has actually executed the rehabilitation scheme, even though they have implemented in few slums, but they have implemented it.
Yeah.
And it has received wide attention, particularly from the city policymaker, politicians, the urban scholar, and also the
Yeah,
NGO.
yeah, and it doesn't seem to be like rife with corruption. I'm sure none of these deals are completely non-corrupt, but it doesn't seem to be one of those situations where everyone was cheated and the private developers ran away. Like that sort of stuff. The base level stuff is taken care of. Now, what you write about, which I found super interesting, is that one of the major issues you find is that slum dwellers are coerced into accepting this housing, oftentimes which is substandard or doesn't have the adequate services, or the cost is much higher than what they were promised, and so on and so forth. So I want to dig in a little bit into this idea of consent and coercion, because this is a weird situation where initially there were no property rights and these people were basically encroachers or squatters. So technically, they don't have the standard rights that require consent for them to be evicted or moved and so on, right? But nobody thinks anymore that slums should be demolished and people should be evicted and thrown out. And that thinking has gone out. Now, how is one supposed to think of consent in this setting, given that by most standards, an additional entitlement is being provided that didn't exist before?
So again, I'm saying that you need to read these two policies separately. That in 2010 policy, there is a clause of consent, and in 2013 policy state, you know, removed the consent clause. So under 2013 policy, developer will not have to take consent from this slum. There is a more of a tender based policy. But what happened in 2010? It was a consent, means developer will have to take consent from the slum, and 75% consent from the slum.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
because unanimity is impossible.
Yes.
So that's kind of the thresholds that we
Yes.
use.
So, and I was interested to know that what is actually happening, particularly in consent seeking exercise, because a lot of things happened in Mumbai. It is well documented, and I came across with Lakhudi Talabari, and what I found that in Lakhudi Talabari, multiple developer visited them and tried to lure them to give consent. This is because of the fact that local government given them a free hand, that okay, you go and give us the consent letter, we will approve the project for you. Now, how developer actually took consent from the slum dweller? So they first approached the community leader, those were influential and leader like person in the settlement.
Yeah.
And
there's a big literature on this, right? Adam Orbach, Tariq Tachil, on how slum leaders emerge, the governance function they play, how they coordinate, they help us with collective action. So they become very important in this situation.
Yes. But what happened? this slum leader who used to play a very important role when it's come to negotiation and also kind of accessing citizenship right for the resident, they become the intermediary in this new scheme. So they work on behalf of the developer, and most majority of the time they have their vested interest. And sometimes they force the resident to give consent, particularly those residents who did not want the rehabilitation to happen. Why? Because they were playing out with limitation in the policy. Like majority of the slum dweller living in a house which is more than 36 square meter. So what to do with those houses? So why would they give consent? Many of them have an emotional attachment to the settlement. Many of them thought that this is an eviction strategy. So why would we why should we trust the developer? So they can grab our land and we be displaced. So all of these things played out, and interestingly, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation did not kind of formally communicated these schemes with the slum dwellers. So initially there were a lot of alienation and anxiety over that what is actually happening with us, who are these people are coming to us.
Got it. So basically, it's not a trusted party. So you don't know if people are swindling you out of a slum dwelling, which actually is quite expensive and has resale value, as we know in the informal market, right? Or are they just evicting you? Are they bribing you? So there's a trust deficit. But this is where I thought the public-private partnership element becomes very important, right?
Yes. So what happened in 2010 policy, there was no mention of that the NGO or community is a actor or stakeholder in this process. So what developer did, particularly in the initial two scheme, Kailas Nagar and Abujina Chapra. So Bisafal, who implemented rehabilitation scheme in Lakhudi, they collaborated with MHD, Mahila Housing Trust, a very popular NGO in Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
So on behalf of developer, MHT actually, kind of mobilized the communities for slum redevelopment scheme. So the places where MHT were involved, things were little bit participatory, but where MHT were absent, like Lakhudi Talabari, like Sanjay Nagar, things were not very easy, means very complicated process because community felt that, their concern were not heard by the developer and the community leader.
So that is the communication aspect of the redevelopment, right?
Yes.
But now you also talk about how when everything goes according to plan, the original plan, right? Which is they moved out for a short period of time, new housing is built, and they are actually moved back in, which is about the best case scenario we have in places like India for slum development. But after that, there are still problems. And, sometimes this is just, they're not used to living in an apartment complex. They are not used to as much distance between them and their neighbor. They used to much more sort of a communal living. They feel isolated. They have a disruption in social networks because they don't understand how to navigate people on the 3rd floor versus the 14th floor. Like there are all these kinds of social things which I can't imagine how one would solve them. But there are other kinds of coercion which are taking place even in moving people back in.
Yeah. So I think one thing that you have mentioned, that why Ahmedabad, is in that sense successful, because I think there is a active involvement of Mahila Housing Trust, particularly in the implementation of 2013 policy and initial this Lakshmi Nagar and Kailas Nagar. But what I found in the post-implementation scenario, that many other issues started unfolding. The lack of or the poor quality of basic services. Although because now there is a huge gap between expectation and reality, so citizens started feeling that why we do not have access to 24/7 water supply. That is
But that's not just them, right? That's everyone.
That's everyone, yes. But I think there is also a sense of dependency that you need to understand. That so far, what happened, if there is anything that some dweller know that whom to approach. sometimes their community leader bargain for their basic rights. But now the whole relationship has changed. So if they have any issue, so now there is a community fund which is insufficient to maintain the settlement. And when the community resident welfare association asking for money that okay, we need to repair this drain, or we need to do this, we need to do that, community is saying that why would we pay? Because you gave us free housing, now you are asking for money. You never said that you know that we will have to contribute for our operation and maintenance. So there is a huge lack of this whole capacity building or sensitizing community about post living in the resettlement colony. That is something that community are not able to digest. And
But this is the part I found quite, difficult to comprehend. Some of it just sounds like middle class complaining, right? Like, even in non-slum settlements, for instance, in Delhi and Bombay, the moment the government says we're not going to subsidize water anymore, you have to actually pay the market tariff for water, people are up in arms saying, we were always promised this entitlement, we were promised free water, now you're charging us for water, water is God's gift, and blah, 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 right? But how much of it is just complaining about, oh, we thought everything was free and now we have to pay, which is again a very urban middle class gripe, versus they've been cheated out of something?
Cheated out in the sense, definitely what I feel that, with initial communication aspect, what community were complaining that, okay, we have been promised a lot of things, particularly 24/7 water supply, good housing and so on and so forth. But again, I'm saying what I tried to make sense of this whole transition.
No, it's very disruptive. That I totally understand. That the way they live is completely different now.
And now the way they used to live, the way they used to access water, the way they used, although they sometimes the lack of water and lack of basic amenities were not there, the access to services not there, but they were still happy. But now this sense of ownership came up with lot of other expectation, which I found, particularly in the resettlement colony.
But is that how we evaluate public policy? Whether people are like happy and satisfied, and if their new expectations and aspirations have been matched? So let me give you an example. I don't mean to belittle the slum rehabilitation at all. Let's say there was a government policy that said we want uptake of farmers to have, mobile phone services so that they can check prices and so on. And they give a subsidy and they start giving free cell phones to everyone. Now, you can say I expected an iPhone because when I go on social media, everyone else is using an iPhone, but I just got like a basic phone. That doesn't seem like a public policy problem to me. Nor does it seem like a public policy failure to me. I mean, at best, it's a failure in communication or something else that's going on, right?
I think the state is only focusing on improvement in the physical environment and looking at the rehabilitation from the perspective of profit, which I have seen that, okay, fine, the whole model is like this, that part of the slumland will be rehabilitated and the part of the slumland can be used for other purposes. So the developer and state can earn profit out of it. But looking at it only from this improvement in physical infrastructure, like giving them houses, is not enough. Which state is not talking about that capacity building or empowering the communities to take care of them. It is not that the community do not want to take care of themselves.
Got it.
Things have happened like Banmekang, Thailand, which is a very successful case, that you are actually building community association. Same thing is happening in Odisha, that they are actually focusing on building capacities of the slum dwelling association. In this case, you are not focusing on building their capacity. So what is happening? The things are more chaotic post-implementation, which was very obvious.
So it's a transition problem, which hopefully can be fixed. So here I have a couple of questions. Can you tell us some of the details in these 4 different slums on how the allotment was done? So from what I understand, it's a lottery or a draw system, which, people in rural India, people in slums are not accustomed to, but as an economist or as a public policy person, we tend to think that's the most fair because it's totally random. It's based on luck. It has no human manipulation or exploitation. So you may be better off, you may be worse off, but it's not meddled with. So once they get the lottery, what happens? Do they get a clean title to the new housing? Can they sell that title? Can they sublet it? So what is that process like
so there
of
is
allotment?
there is a 15 years of restriction. So after that, it will be a freehold right. So now they haven't received the ownership right certificate. So many of them are kind of anxious about it. If you read the policy guideline, it is after 15 years they will get that ownership right certificate. And particularly in Ahmedabad, there is no such issues, particularly when it's come to allotment, except Lakpuri Talavari, where a lot of scams and corruptions happen.
Yeah.
As Bisafal single-handedly implemented it, and the CAG also reported that scheme. What happened in Ahmedabad, I think, thanks to Mahila Housing Trust, because they set up the mechanism that even though we have randomly allocated you the houses, so internally you can kind of exchange the houses.
Yeah.
So that thing happened in Nakhudi, in Sanjay Nagar, in many other places. So internally they exchange their houses. There are always dissatisfaction, but it never came out as big as we thought it would happen in allotment.
Now, I mean, this seems like a relatively easy fix. I mean, we have so much mechanism design literature on this, on, how the original lottery happens, and then what are the rules under which people can exchange, and that's pretty straightforward. Now, do you think this entire system can be improved if they could sublet these spaces or they could sell them in under 15 years? Is that the main problem?
Yes, because if you read the larger kind of literature, you will find that this is definitely an issue that subject slum resident or the space where slum dweller living is subject to real estate market. So eventually what happened, the whole place will kind of gentrify. So the whole idea is to keep them out of the market. But nowadays what is happening that you are.
But I don't understand, why would that be the whole idea, to keep them out of the market?
Because you are what can I say, because the whole intention is to improve their living condition, is to keep them basic living standard, right? But what is happening when you are redeveloping a slum in the central area where the land value is very high, and you know that now your house is an asset and you can now sell it, so what will happen then? They will eventually sell those houses and they will move back to some other places.
Why is that a problem, right? So what I'm trying to understand is, why is that such a terrible thing if the idea is maybe they sell this house and they find better housing, maybe somewhere else, which is, they're complaining that this is not good quality, this is substandard, there are all these problems, there's this huge disruption, the association doesn't work well. What's the harm in selling and moving to a place where it does work well?
You are all not talking about the integration of rehabilitation or housing policies with the larger urban economy, because we are here talking about low income households. So particularly the people who cannot afford to live in the city, or the income is very meager. So eventually what happens, they will not move back to a middle class housing complexes, they will move to slum, or they will form slum some other places. So eventually what your own whole intention you started with, you will not achieve it, right?
But there seems to be some dissonance here, which I can't exactly understand. So, on the one hand, we say slum dwellers don't want to live in a slum setting, right? They want to live in sensible urban areas that give them access to labor markets and economic opportunity and allow them to participate. But they don't want to live in a place that has no electricity, no water, open sewage, their kids are falling sick and so on. So we need to improve the physical infrastructure. So far, I completely understand. Now, the next stage of the problem that you very well document is, once you improve the physical infrastructure, they say, no, we don't like this version, either because it doesn't meet our expectation or because some of the networks are disrupted, or, that life we used to live where everyone used to sit together in the courtyard is now gone away, and, so on. Now, if they wish to move back to slums, then the first aspiration of them wanting to not live in a slum setting is wrong. So why are we so worried that they'll sell their allotment and move back to a slum? That doesn't quite add up. And if they move back to a slum, then they didn't want the rehabilitation in the first place, which means all this complaining is not really about the rehabilitation. It's about a different way of living. Because it can't be both, right? It has to be one or the other.
Yes.
So what is going on with these slum dwellers that even the terrible physical infrastructure in slums seems like a better alternative than good physical infrastructure?
What I found is that the way slum dwellers live in a settlement, the way they use their housing, the way they make decisions, the way they navigate the city, and sometimes, and the whole aspect of incrementality, the way that as time permit, as their economy improve, they extend or develop their houses, right? And that's more of an organic development that we are talking about. Slum redevelopment is definitely a better alternative when it comes with other benefits, not only improving their physical infrastructure, but we also have to think about that once they move to those new houses, they should sustain their living in the new housing, because you are not improving their economy. And when their operation and maintenance cost increase, so they face major hurdle. Second, you are not sensitizing them to a new living that they are going to encounter once rehabilitation takes place, which I have found that, the lack of socialization, lack of access to gender space and all, because this issue is largely related to the design aspect, that you are not involving community in the design. What you think is best for the community, you are doing that. Unless and until you involve, okay, fine, we need a park. Okay, fine, can you do our design in this way? Can our house be like this? Why you are not involving the community? Because they are the one who is going to live in those settlements. So there is a huge disjuncture between the need and aspiration. It is not that they do not want to live in those rehabilitation colony, but the mechanism that you have created, it is making it very difficult for them to live in the new environment.
So you're talking both at the design stage, like how is this building designed? How is the common space designed? And then the second part of it is the maintenance. How is the housing association formed? What are the first few years? What is the plan? When does the developer hand over to the community? Things like that.
And also sensitizing them to the new living. Like, what happened, more of a communal living to more of an individualistic living. Like, pehle kya hota tha? There were garbage.
No, but I am, okay, so maybe this is just a gap in our view of what is the role of the state.
Yeah.
Right? I think the role of the state absolutely is it needs to make sure that property rights are enforced, contracts are enforced, basic public sanitation, water, access to all what we typically call public goods, right? I don't think making people happy is the role of the state.
Yes.
Forget slum redevelopment. I think in general, like making people happy is not the...
Making them owner, and that the sense of belonging and sense of ownership should come with this development.
I don't think this is a slum issue. This is any redevelopment, any disruption, any change in living. How family homes in Chandni Chowk, which had this huge courtyard in the middle, start getting partitioned into smaller and smaller lots. This happens everywhere. It is just a transition issue and so on. But for me, the policy issues are the other things you're pointing out, which is how do they get their allotment? Are they in a place which gives them the connection to the economic services they had before? How is this building association actually going to run itself? Do they have to contribute monthly maintenance expenses? Those are serious public goods coordination questions. And I think there I am a little bit more concerned about what's going on.
two issue I would highlight here. The first, that the way we define housing, I think what we are creating is house, only a dwelling unit. But I think there is a consensus that housing is beyond a dwelling unit. It is about privacy. It is about access to services. It should be affordable. It should be adequate. So what is happening that in rehabilitation schemes, when you are trying to evaluate rehabilitation or redevelopment against this parameter, that is it really affordable, is it really
Yeah.
adequate, many cases those rehabilitation scheme is not qualified uh, to be called adequate or affordable option for the urban poor household. And once you create that mechanism where it is adequate and affordable for the urban poor household, it will serve the purpose, I think. What Odisha state is actually doing, because Odisha state is, I think, widely known scheme called Jaga Mission. So what they did, they first provided them with a land right, the right which is mortgageable, which is
Yeah.
inheritable, but not
Yeah.
transferable, so that the land remained to the urban poor household. And then what they did, they integrated this land right with access to basic services and amenities, and also upgradation programs. So the second phase of Jaga Mission is talking about participatory Islam upgradation. Uh, so I think there are many options that we can think of. So far, we are thinking, we are only talking about one size fit for all. Majority of the
Yeah.
cases,
Absolutely. That is so clear in what you're saying, which
yeah,
is, and you know, that one size fits for all, at least the way I understood it in your dissertation, is really coming from the developer, right? So the developer is like, what is it I can build quickly and deliver? That seems to be the driving force rather than what would be the longer term best solution, which we can maybe fix at the design stage. And then, we can partition the houses or the dwelling sizes accordingly. Did I understand that correctly?
developer and also local government, particularly because
Okay.
local
So,
government
can
is
you tell me a little bit more about that one size fits all problem, which is actually leading to all these other problems, which is, showing up in this weird kind of complaining about problems that can't really be fixed from a policy lens. But maybe you're right, they can be fixed at an earlier design stage. So, what is that design stage other than participation? Participation in the original design or the architectural plan, like what is that gap which needs to be met early on?
definitely, since the beginning of the project till end, there should be a thorough community participation. What is happening here, that there are few things which is, it's more like a top down policy approach, that there are few things neither the developer nor the local government can change. So in slum redevelopment, this problem is going to remain.
Can you give me an example of that? What are the things that can't be changed because it's top down?
Like the major issues that slum dwellers are facing is definitely the size of the houses, right? That those,
Okay.
because they are getting an uniform size. So even though I have a 60 square meter house, but I am getting the 30 square meter house, and this is written in the policy guideline that you cannot, even if you have houses more than 30 square meter, you will not get more than 30 square meter house. So can we fix that? Can we fix that limitation? So later what happened, they fixed that problem, particularly in case of Kailas Nagar, they call it project affected person, PAP. So if someone is living another house, the son and daughter, more than 18-year age and above, so if they can show document or if they can pay 3 lakhs rupees, they will get an extra house. Okay.
Got it.
Many of such inherent policy issues. Second, as you have said, that initial implementation process, the trust issue were there. So MHT set up a mechanism that shall we issue a photo identity card? Shall we have an agreement with the developer that once before they leave for transit accommodation, they will have that photo identity card and they will have that letter. It's an assurance that, so many of those mechanisms work, particularly in gaining consent and trust. And third, definitely, which we are not talking about, capacity building of the community association.
Yeah. So, on the capacity building of the community association, this is the part that surprised me the most in your dissertation. And the reason it surprised me the most is the kind of coordination and capacity that is shown within slums, right? Because it's basically outside of the limits of state services, right? So it's people picking up their own garbage, people figuring out, there are these weird loose hanging electricity lines because someone has jigged the electricity supply to that place. The water pipes are all in weird locations. They don't make sense. There's a communal bathroom. So to me, that sounded particularly crazy because I was like, these are people who actually know how to run a building association in the worst of circumstances. In fact, they are providing sewage, sanitation, garbage, they're providing everything. How is it that these people are not able to run a simple apartment building condo association? I've lived in more than half a dozen different cities. Everyone's able to do this. And of all the people I thought capable, I thought those who were coming out of slums would be the most capable. So what is this gap that I am completely missing?
One thing is that there is, again, I said that the attitude, that communal attitude to a more individualistic attitude, that my house, I'll take care of it. And second attitude is that we got a free house, so somewhere and somehow an individual person will come and fix all those things. And third,
Ah.
that we have community association, and the association have money, because thing that I have missed that some portion of money.
Yeah, there's a corpus that is initially given. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all of them know that there is a money. So even if something happen, this is our association or the cooperative housing society will take care of it. So, and there is a issue that when cooperative housing society are not functioning, so they are forced to do few things, even though they do not want to. So this whole thing is kind of puzzled me during my field.
Right? This is a little bit crazy, right? Because
Yes.
slum dweller governance, when I read the literature and the case studies on this, they move mountains. Sometimes mountains of garbage, but they move mountains to make things work in their particular community. So, here, actually, what you're telling me surprisingly is making me a little bit more optimistic. Right? Because some of this sounds like bad expectation setting and bad communication. And hopefully, as we have more in situ rehabilitations and redevelopments, we learn from this. Even the NGOs and other trusted parties who've been involved in it, there's a lot of learning that takes place, right? So with each model, hopefully it gets better. For instance, the first one that you pointed out, this is the Lakuri Talavadi. There were so many problems in that particular rehabilitation, which have later, the later ones seem to have managed that well. So that part is really making me optimistic. But the second part that's making me optimistic is these are people who are incredibly entrepreneurial, right? Who can actually really do a lot of groundwork when it comes to coordination, public goods, delivery systems, solving collective action problems. So to me, some of this also seems like a transitional problem, right?
Yes.
Initially, they come in thinking this is someone else's problem. As the problems start mounting up, they're going to have a big meeting and a big protest. They're going to sack whoever is the original person who was running the, cooperative society building. They're going to nominate their own leader and things will surely get better. Is there some design flaw that gets in the way of that, or these are just growing pains? This is going to happen in any disruption and redevelopment, so they will just have to sort this out.
It is the problem of institutional framework that the policy is not talking about. The policy is saying that, okay, fine, we are giving them houses, we are giving them free houses, and that's fine. Our work is done. Then nobody is looking at what is happening in those post-rehabilitation colony, because now those places are no longer slum. Those are cooperative housing society. Those are like middle-class housing complexes. People are not used to those life. Although you have a cooperative housing society or you have a community association, but they don't know their responsibilities. They don't know how to make sense of this new living, how to make sense of this management. So I think when I was talking to MHD, the majority of the cases, MHD said that, okay, fine, we should now focus on building the capacities of the community association so that once they move in, all of this issue should be taken care of. And this community empowerment and this whole institution building aspect should be present in the policy formulation.
Yeah, because there's no exit.
Yes, because in Jaga Mission, which I have seen, so the Odisha government hired Janagraha, the Bangalore-based NGO, to build the capacities of the SDA. So long-term operation and maintenance can be taken care of. It's not about 2-3 years, but long-term operation and maintenance. So that effort is somewhere and somehow missing.
But I have a question on that. So isn't that easy to introduce even after all the physical rehabilitation has been done? Because now this seems like a much easier fix, which is, the local municipality, the local NGOs, they get together, they help do some workshops, they set up a decent model, they get some community acceptance on, hey, this is how a cooperative society works, these are the 6 models you pick from. Isn't this now a much smaller policy problem? Somehow it doesn't seem that insurmountable. Especially given that there's no exit for 15 years, so they have to all live with each other.
Yes.
Which means they have to build a cooperative society. But now that the physical infrastructure is in place, what is stopping this from happening even after the redevelopment? This can happen at any point, right?
Because anyway, local government is shying away from its responsibility because they are just only focusing on redevelopment, and somewhere and somehow the larger responsibility that the state have, that okay, fine, we need to take care of this settlement, we need to take care of this resident. They are not talking about it. It is the developer who is always profit minded. Fine, they are not sensitized enough, they are not aware enough what to do with those residents. I think in that case, what you are saying is very interesting because the NGO can play a very, very important role, which MHD is somewhere and somehow playing, but that partnership is somewhere and somehow missing. The residents should be given some time to adjust to their living, and within that time, the local government and NGO can build their capacities, and within that time, the local government can take care of everything. So once you do that, I think things can be easily fixed.
Yeah. Or at least, there's some mechanism. We're not even hoping to fix everything, right? You're basically saying that the platforms to discuss these problems and fix them is what is missing. Not that everything will be perfect from day one and everything will be magically fixed. It's more, they had a particular way of coordinating and governing in the old setting, and now we just have to figure out what that coordination and governance mechanism is in the new setting.
And how to live.
Some of it can be introduced, but most of it just has to be built. There's no quick fix. It just takes time to build these systems, right? I've lived in condos in New York City and we've had the same problems there, by the way. So it just takes a long time to figure this out. But this dissertation was hugely illuminating and you show a contrast of the different models over time. The case studies are really interesting. Thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.